Hello, folks. It's Matthew Street, and welcome to the Beatles Album Spotlight Series, Episode 3. And, folks, for this episode, we're going to turn to Beatles compilation albums. Yes, and the first one we're going to is this one, which was released on June 7th, 1976. The Beatles Rock and Roll Music, which was originally a 2 LP set. Here's the original vinyl right here with its Coca-Cola flavored labels, right? And also, there's 28 tracks on these 2 LPs. 15 of them are Lennon-McCartney originals, 1 George Harrison original, but then you have 12 by the great rock and roll pioneers, 12 great covers. So, folks, 28 total. First time that the song I'm Down, which was the flip side to the Help single back in 1965, first time I'm Down is seen on a U.S. Beatles long-playing album, so that's on here. That's a big plus because I love that song. And when this release was first coming out, folks, George Martin wasn't happy with Capitol. He didn't like the mixes and the way they were going to be putting these kind of like subpar mixes out to the public. So thankfully, George Martin got a hold of these mixes or these tracks before they went out and were released here, and he did some tinkering with them and fixing them up a little bit to at least make them passable because he was not happy with the sound at all. So the sound, it does have a unique sound to it. Check it out if you do have this album, but some of the mixes are a little bit, they're not as good as what the Beatles wanted, what George Martin originally wanted. They're kind of Capitol Frankenstein mixes, but George did the best he could. And you know what? The sound isn't too bad. It has that cool rock and roll vibe to it. So he did a good job on fixing up the mixes. Now, the single on this album was Got to Get You Into My Life. It made number 7 in the top 100. Wow, 6 years after the Beatles broke up, they get a top 10 hit. That's great. Now, it only made number 2 on the album charts. And the reason it didn't make it to number 1 is because guess what? Paul McCartney's album with Wings, called Wings at the Speed of Sound, held on to that number 1 spot that week that this album could have been in there, and it blocked it out. So Paul blocked out his former band from reaching another number 1. But it did make number 2, and it did go platinum. There's been over 1 million copies of this album sold, and I'm sure if we got current numbers, it would be much higher than that. Now, this was the second major compilation album by the Beatles to come out after the Red and Blue album, 62 to 66 and 67 to 70. And so this was a big deal when it was coming out. I was on the school bus one day, and the bus driver was a cool bus driver, and he used to play top 40 radio and standard radio on the bus. It was very fun to hear all the great current hits. Well, Got to Get You Into My Life came on one day, and I was stunned. I was blown away by how good it was, because to me, it was like a new Beatles song. At that point, I was only a young sophomore, I think, in high school. I was still doing my Beatle album collecting of their original run of albums, and I think Revolver was the last Beatles album I did not have yet. So I was not familiar with Got to Get You Into My Life. So when that bus driver had that radio on and I heard that song, it knocked me out, folks. I fell in love with the song, and I think it probably led me to get Revolver quicker than I would have, but I did. And I got into that whole Beatles are back thing that was going on in 1976. I mean, in 1976, with this album coming out, it got big, big promotion. You had Paul and Wings touring the USA, Wings Over America that year. Big deal, made a lot of the newspapers and news broadcasts and whatnot. And it was like a whole new wave of Beatlemania was happening back then. So Capitol promoted this big time. It did well on the charts. Now, the Beatles themselves hated this compilation. They didn't like the cover. They didn't like the sound of it. I think Ringo made a quote back in the day that, hey, John's a better artist. He would have done a better one than they could have done here, which is probably true. But I have to admit, folks, I like parts of this cover. I do enjoy the cover. I think it's nice. I think if they got rid of these silly thumbs here, the cover itself would be a lot nicer. I love the silver foil background. I like the artistic rendering of the Beatles and the whole rock and roll thing. And a lot of people have critiqued this because of the 50s kind of motif, with the Coca-Cola there. And then when you look on the inside, you got Marilyn Monroe and you got a 57 Chevy or whatever it is, like sock hop kind of look to it. And people complained about that, but I have to say, I kind of look at it from a different angle, folks. a big bulk of the songs on here are by the 50s rock and roll pioneers. The covers, look at the list of the cover songs on here. It's a lot of the rockin' pioneers that influenced the Beatles. So if you want to look at it from that angle, I thought that's what this was saying, is the Beatles, rock and roll. They were influenced by the 50s artists, which led them to be who they were. So this is celebrating that here are the Beatles, how they rock originally with their original tunes, and here's the Beatles rocking, covering the 50s pioneers. That's the way I looked at it anyway, and I've always thought it was a fine compilation, and I still enjoy it to this day. Folks, you can still find it out there. Then and years later, it came out in 2 separate volumes, Volume 1 and Volume 2 like this. But I still, a special place in my heart still goes with the original. I love that silver foil cover, and I love the fact that so many rock and roll pioneer cover songs are on here. I love it, folks. It's a great compilation. I recommend just having it in your collection. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye. See you on the next episode. Please subscribe.